Thank you so much, Victoria. It is such a fun thing for me to be here with you guys today. So thank you so much for having me and inviting me. I'm just delighted. So my name is Grace Hamman. I'm an independent scholar and a writer, and I'm married to Scott, my husband, and I have 3 little kids, ages 9, 7, and 4. So we are very fun, and we are also very busy. And I wrote, as Victoria mentioned, a book that came out last year called Jesus Through Medieval Eyes. And here are my 3 kids with my book at the bookstore at Barnes & Noble. And as you can see, 2/3 of them were very proud of their mother and pleased by her accomplishment. And 1/3 of them was unamused and uninterested, and in fact, just generally not a fan. So, yes, so there you go. However, I'm not worried. She's only 4, and that means I have a lot of years to convert her to being a medievalist. So, don't be concerned. It's going to be okay. So today I'm here to chat with you about one of the images from my book. This is the idea of Jesus as a lover or a bridegroom. And for medieval artists and readers and thinkers, they believed that the union between God and the human soul was not an arranged marriage, not a marriage of convenience, nor a dynastical union, but a love match. A marriage made in mutual desire, joy, and even mutual submission. And just to warn you all, this might get slightly PG-13. Medieval people were not shy about their bodies or saying strange things, so just FYI. So for those whose history is fuzzier than they may wish, when I say medieval, I mean the period from about 500 to 1500 AD, or the sack of Rome to the European venture to the Americas, or St. Augustine to Martin Luther. So this is an enormous swath of time that covers a very, very broad range of ideas and places and spaces and people. So I usually focus on the later end of that time period. Most of the interesting art and poetry that we'll be looking at today comes from the 14th, 15th, and a little bit of the early 16th centuries. But the idea of Jesus as a bridegroom has very deep scriptural pre-medieval roots, which we'll return to in just a moment. So in this talk, I'll be looking at a few different pieces belonging to this tradition, from poetry to theology to images. And in this motif, Jesus is variously a suffering romantic knight. He's sometimes bound or pierced by arrows. He's doing odd things like playing hide and seek or playing the drums to bring joy to his lover. So this is a wide array of images and ideas. I'm going to begin with a 14th century poem. So this poem was composed about the same time that Geoffrey Chaucer was writing his Canterbury Tales, very similar time period, in the version of English that we now call Middle English. And you can transport yourself back 600 years for a moment, before the Reformation, before Shakespeare, to the beginning of a poem of Jesus as a wounded knightly hero. This poem has no title, as was common with most medieval poetry. Most modern titles that are given to them by modern editors. So this poem is sometimes called In the Valley of Restless Mind, and it's sometimes called Quia Amore Langueo. And we don't know who wrote it. Again, pretty normal for most medieval poems. But it's one of the loveliest medieval lyrics that exists in a wonderfully weird tradition, and it appears twice in medieval manuscripts, once from a collection of devotional and mystical poetry that's now held at Lambeth in England, and another in a manuscript that's at Cambridge. And Quia Amore Langueo is going to be our interpretive and devotional companion. It's going to guide us into the deeper gifts and nuances of this medieval image of Jesus as our lover. And along the way, we'll broaden out and look at other authors and artists and ideas, but Quia Amore Languio is kind of like our trailhead, and as we go further into this tradition. So, as the poem opens, we find ourselves in what the narrator calls the veil of restless mind. So he's talking about inside his own head. And he's searching for true love. Following a mournful voice, the narrator discovers a handsome stranger with an air of kingliness about him. And this stranger shows the narrator his bleeding side, and he's wounded from head to foot, and he sits under a tree, and he's sighing and weeping for his love. And I'm going to read to you in Middle English, but there's the translation and the Middle English up here. And if you want, you can just close your eyes and listen to the language from 600 years ago, or you can watch and follow along in the modern English. And this is what the kingly, wounded, mysterious knight answers. I am true love, that false was never. Mi sister, mane sul, I loved her thus. Because we would no wise discover, I left me kingdom glorious. I purveyed for her a palace precious. She fleeth, I follow. I sought her so, I suffered this pain piteous, quia amore languio. Now, spoiler alert, if you haven't figured it out already, this is Jesus talking to us, this melancholy night. And who is Jesus wooing? He is wooing man's soul. Writers and theologians tend to use she, her for the soul because of ancient language conventions. But medieval thinkers and artists understood each of us, male and female, as being the bride of Christ. We sometimes think of only nuns, or maybe some women, as being brides of Christ. And of course, nuns did have a special affinity for this language and really loved the language of bride and bridegroom. But male theologians and contemplatives like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Bonaventure, a Dominican writer, Henry Suso, the mystical writer, Jan Ruysbroek, they all wrote of being brides of Christ too. And this wasn't just confined to unmarried folks. Married women, like Marjorie Kemp in late medieval England, wrote of their marriage to God. So these medieval thinkers make something clear to us. We should not only see the bride and bridegroom relationship as applicable to Christ and the corporate church, which is certainly true, but we are invited to understand each one of ourselves as individual brides of Christ, regardless of gender or marital status. All right, I am a bride, lover of Jesus. I think this is where some of us might get a little nervous or tripped up with this idea is in three particular places, sort of problem areas. The first myth or problem is that we might primarily filter the idea of Jesus as our lover through our own personal romantic relationships, the good and the bad. Some of us have experienced deeply broken romantic relationships, whether in abuse, divorce, or just really messy breakups. Is God going to be like that too? The good news is that he's not. God is infinitely good, infinitely true, infinitely beautiful. So that doesn't have a place in this imagery. The second myth or problem is kind of similar. We associate this idea exclusively with women, and particularly with a type of sentimentality. So when I was in college, I read a very, very chart-topping bestseller Christian book. And it introduced Jesus as a lover, but it introduced it literally as Mel Gibson from Braveheart. And she writes, Jesus was like Mel Gibson, and he was gonna sweep me up on a white horse. And she said, "Isn't that what every girl wants?" And now picture nerdy Grace being like, I'll pass. Thanks, though. I just then assumed that all of the things around this idea were not for me. So I was like, that is weird. I don't really want that. And it didn't seem fair because boys got like a camping buddy Jesus instead. And I was like, that seems more fun and less awkward than Mel Gibson Jesus. One might respond, but isn't that kind of what Quia Amore Langueo is doing? That sounds kind of Mel Gibson adjacent. Hot Jesus in armor? No, and we're about to see why. This image of Jesus defies modern expectations of gender. It doesn't map neatly onto what we expect. And it goes far deeper than a Christianized Braveheart or a romantic leading man. This metaphor isn't sentimental. It touches both heart and mind, and it's used by Jesus himself. And it is for both men and women. The third myth is that we might look at somebody like St. Teresa of Avila, and I have up here Bernini's very famous Teresa in Ecstasy sculpture. Or we might look at somebody like the German late medieval mystical writer Mechtild of Magdeburg, and she was a Begin. She wasn't a nun, but she had a vowed religious life, and she had these amazing visionary experiences, and her writing is often close to something sexually scandalous in pursuit of her lover Jesus. So for instance, and then he, Jesus, begins so to caress her so that she becomes weak. She so begins to drink it all in that he becomes lovesick. Then he begins to limit the intensity because he knows better her limits than she herself does. Now, when I read that, I was in a coffee shop, and I was like, I hope no one is reading this over my shoulder. Is this a romance novel, or is this a 13th century German mystic writer? I can't tell. And so I think some of us, that's what we think of when we think of this image too, is this sort of ecstatic experience of the mystics. And is that what we are called into? Is that supposed to be a norm? Now, maybe for some of us, I don't doubt Teresa or Mechtild, but this sort of ecstatic, both pleasurable and painful experience of Jesus the lover is not universal, nor is it a norm, even for medieval writers and thinkers. We may associate bridal mysticism, this tradition, with ecstasy and moments outside of time, but in fact, all of this devotion to Jesus as a lover or bridegroom was much more closely tied to practices, to prayer, to discipline, observance of the liturgical year, cultivating contemplative prayer, than it was to these ecstatic moments. So the ecstatic experience of the mystic is not the main point of the idea of Jesus as a lover, and it's not the main point in helping us to understand more deeply Christ's character or our own identity as brides of Christ. It's not any of these things that make Jesus our lover. There are, of course, a lot of weird medieval things out there. But at their best, this is what I've learned from my medieval brothers and sisters. To embrace being a bride of Christ meant to reject the false allurements of the world, to turn from sin, and to learn how to passionately and vulnerably love God with your whole body and your whole soul. To embrace Jesus as a lover meant to enter into holy union with the God of the universe, to be welcomed with the hospitality, generosity, and true love of the triune God, to enter into and bear the fruit of divine love. So all of these images and poetry and recordings of contemplative experiences are meant for spiritual formation, not for self-gratification, titillation, or an exercise in weird medieval whimsy, which, don't get me wrong, I love weird medieval whimsy, but it's not the point. They're intended to help us understand the character of Jesus, who we are in relation to him, and the nature of our union with him in faith and in the consummation of time. So back to Quia Amore Langueo. Where does this imagery come from? Of Jesus' true love as the bleeding, ardent hero who has left heaven, his glorious kingdom, in pursuit of his love, man's soul. The poem's repeating Latin tag gives us a little hint. It's from the Vulgate. Quia amore languio, because I languish for love, is from the Latin text of the Song of Songs. Yes, that very colorful book of the Bible that you maybe encountered for the first time in middle school or high school and then were kind of shocked by and that you never heard mentioned from the pulpit. It was at least that was my experience, and I was always somewhat surprised that it was even there. What is it doing? Now, my modern experience is such a contrast to the way that medieval people thought about and wrote about and were absolutely obsessed with this book. I was baffled when I began studying medieval literature because the Song of Songs was extremely popular among patristic and medieval commentators. They just loved it. They couldn't get enough of it. And the basis of its popularity was this. It was read as a story. It was a story. It was an allegory of the love that God bears for each human soul and the love that humans can learn in return. Now, where would they get the incentive to read it allegorically rather than, say, a love poem between two humans, which most historical critical commentators today read it that way? Even before the birth of Jesus, Jewish exegetes were reading the Song of Songs as a tale of love between God and his people. So this is a very, very old way of reading this. Bridegroom imagery is also scattered throughout the prophets. And then this continues on in the Gospels, especially John. You can't get away from the bridegroom imagery. It's practically in every chapter. Jesus compares himself to a bridegroom and is compared by others. And in Revelations, the bridegroom comes to marry the bride, the church, in the vision of the end of days. So medieval writers began to think about why this metaphor was so important to Jesus and what we might understand about the shape of his love, his character, and our response to him. Early church theologians like Origen wrote massive series and sermons on the Song of Songs. And Gregory the Great, the influential theologian and pope from 590 to 604, he writes about the Song of Songs and its capacities to awaken the soul. And he has a really good summation here of the attitude of those early writers and of later monastic writers towards this bestseller book of the Bible. For allegory supplies the soul, separated far from God, with a kind of mechanism by which it is raised to God. Through means which are not alien to our way of understanding, that which is beyond our understanding can be known. Thus it is that in this book, called the Song of Songs, we find the words of a bodily love, so that the soul, its numbness caressed into warmth by familiar words, through the words of a lower love is excited to a higher. For in this book are described kisses, breasts, cheeks, limbs, and this holy language is not to be held in ridicule because of these words. Rather, we are provoked to reflect on the mercy of God. For by his naming of the parts of the body by which he calls us to love, we must be aware of how wonderfully and mercifully he works in us. For he goes so far as to use the language of our shameful loves in order to set our heart on fire with a holy love. So allegory, according to Gregory, is like a crane, that mechanism language. It grabs our understanding, which is limited and very human, and using human concepts like romantic love and body parts, it lifts our understanding up into divine things. Gregory argues that the language of passionate love, even body parts, beckons us into a deeper, more experiential understanding of God's love. So the numb soul, worn down by sin and the cares and the mundanity and all the tedious little things of embodied life, may be caressed into warmth once again. So this passionate language is meant to call forth a passionate response. Now, Gregory was clearly not enthused about embodied or sensual language on its own. He was a celibate pope, and in medieval culture, sexual expression was looked upon as dubious at best. One of the greatest differences between Christian culture of the Middle Ages and the Christian culture of today is that, for the most part, Christians today revere marriage and married people, often above singleness and single people, to our detriment. It was completely the opposite in the Middle Ages. Vowed virginity was viewed as the highest and holiest way of living. So this emphasis on this language in the Song of Songs is a little surprising, and it's an incentive to us to take this imagery we are about to examine not as salacious or titillating, but as an interpretive move. God speaks some of our most powerful, arresting, attention-getting language to us, humbly using one of our most powerful and characteristically human experiences to help us understand something so radically beyond ourselves as the character of divine love. So this language is incarnational. So Quia Amore Languio takes on the Song of Songs, this theme of God, the lover of the soul, and soul, the lover of God, and gives it a medieval flair. Consider that love matches, at least for the aristocracy, were very rare in the Middle Ages. So the idea of romantic love was most popular in the chivalric tales and in the stories of King Arthur and his knights and their adventures. And they had their ladies that they jousted for and protected, wore their emblem, wrote poetry for, all that stuff. And that this was that chivalric culture of the late Middle Ages. So we get Jesus as lover, as a suffering, noble, gracious knight. And he is embodied form of 1 John 4:8, God is love. He says, I am true love. So he continues on, my fair spouse and my love bright, I saved her from beating, and she hath beat me. I clothed her in grace and heavenly light. This bloody shirt she hath set on me. For longing of love, yet I will not stop. Sweet strokes are these, lo. I have loved her ever, as I promised her, because I languish for love. One of the characteristically medieval ways of reading scripture was to see Jesus in every story, regardless of chronologically where it appears in the Bible. So every part of the Hebrew scriptures could be read as pointing to Christ and redemption, and so even love songs like the Song of Songs pointed to crucifixion and resurrection. Quia Amore Languio follows this tradition. From Song of Songs to the Gospels and Revelation, it fuses together the bridegroom motifs and understands the lover as dying for his love. Jesus has so loved man's soul that he refuses to be separated from her, and he goes in search of her. And she has rejected him, even beating him, clothing him in blood, but he so longs for her and loves her that he will not cease. Now, today, we, especially Protestants, are used to understanding the cross almost exclusively through the frame of atonement theories, or at least the expiation of sin. And of course, this is super important, and this understanding was certainly important for medieval people as well. But simultaneously, they saw in the Passion a radical display of love on show. In this frame, in a theme that was just incredibly popular in the Middle Ages, the incarnation and the crucifixion both become acts of wooing the soul, of emblems of love and of faithfulness. So if you've ever walked through an art gallery and wondered why late medieval of the cross is often so incredibly bloody or focused on Christ's wounds, this is why. When you look at these wounds and this blood and this broken body, you are meant to see the lengths to which God was willing to go for love. So a huge tradition of contemplative prayer developed around meditating on the cross and Christ's sufferings and Christ's wounds, specifically as signs of love. So just like in Christian publishing today, many people wrote aids and guides and even illustrated ones to help readers learn how to see and how to read the love of God in Christ's wounded body. Whether in art of the Passion that was very explicitly obvious, or in these more abstract metaphorical versions. So devotional aids were developed to help you learn how to see Jesus as a lover and see yourself as lover too, receiving divine love, being transformed. These devotional aids were extremely popular for both lay people and for nuns and monks. And a modern day scholar, Rabbi Gregory, writes of how brides of Christ, like the 15th century Dominican writer Henry Suso, or Mechtild of Magdeburg, who I quoted to you, how they wrote their contemplative works not to show how special and amazing and fabulous they were, but to help others follow their footsteps in contemplation of God's love. One of these devotional aids is a popular poem and illustrations from medieval Germany. And it instructs viewers on what it means to become a lover of Christ. It's called Christus und die mennende Seele, Christ and the Loving Soul. And it was a fascinating poem in late medieval Germany, 15th century. This poem was copied in manuscripts, and it was also printed in book form and in broadsheets that look like this. This is a broadsheet, and it works like a comic strip, a devotional comic strip. People would, sometimes they would look at the whole thing. Sometimes they would cut out the different scenes and paste them in their prayer books. These came in slightly different orders. They weren't always uniform. And this broadsheet circulated both inside and outside monasteries and convents, and it was used as sort of a template of the experience of loving and seeking the bridegroom. Now it starts at the bottom in that bed, and it's a divine awakening. The soul awakes to the startling reality of the love of Christ. So there's the soul, there's Jesus. Sometimes it's an angel in these, and Jesus is waking up the soul. And then we have kind of a tough sequence following after that. They're fasting. The soul is fasting at the table. And then in the next one, the next scene is called the blinding and the laming, which sounds very scary. It's the process of learning how to see with not your own eyes and how to not rely on your own faculties. And then there's castigation of the flesh, and then you move up to the next scene, and that is the soul setting aside relying on books to know God. And then the next page, or the next scene, is the soul setting aside her spinning. No more of your labors. And we begin to see that though this is definitely uncomfortably harsh in some ways, this is a medieval portrait of the soul coming to rely on Jesus alone. Bodily power, education, work itself, none of these are substitutes for divine love and its reality. None of these are the soul's true vocation. Even at last, clothes are stripped away. And like Jesus, in that one on the end there, the vulnerable soul carries her cross and is crucified in his love. And in the poem, Jesus says to the soul, I suspend you in this moment above everything that is earthly. And the soul responds, what shall come out of this? I can perceive neither heaven nor earth. What shall come out of this? And isn't that a question we can relate to in the asking? in some of life's suffering for love that many of us have experienced. One of the things that comes out of this for the soul is you start to see in the next line up, Jesus and the soul are playing hide and seek. So Jesus is hiding behind the curtain. And Jesus hides from the soul pursues him and will always find him. And in some of these, it's reversed. The soul is hiding behind the curtain. Jesus is pursuing her. It goes both directions. In Qui Amore Languio, we've already met Jesus looking and looking and looking for the soul. And this dynamic of absence and presence speaks deeply, I think, to how we feel in our ordinary lives of faith. You just, that game of hide and seek is very real. And it too comes out of the Song of Songs, as both lovers of the Song of Songs seek one another, are looking for each other. There's something deeply comforting about this dynamic of faith portrayed in this way. It's not that Christ has left the soul, but that sometimes we cannot find him, but he continues to seek us as avidly as ever before. In the next set of events, if you're looking closely, much of the previous positions and illustrations are reversed. So the bride falls asleep in the comfort of Christ's love, as Jesus says, "Let no one awaken my daughter, nor make her afraid of me." Jesus teaches the soul in his heart. He is bound and captured by her. He is the one pierced by her in love, and that is the amazing version of the soul shooting Jesus with a bow and arrow, which is one of the strangest things that I think I've encountered in looking at these, is that picture of the soul aiming her arrow at Christ. All of these have root verses in the Song of Songs, and from the awakening to the languishing for love to the coronation imagery. These are from manuscript versions of Christus und die Männerseele, where Jesus continues to woo the soul and enchant her with music and rejoice with her. And these are some of my favorites. They're just very charming. So Jesus is playing the drums, Jesus is playing the violin, and the final picture in this sequence is always Jesus and the soul embracing in divine union. And sometimes they're in a bed, sometimes they're standing together. So this poem and these illustrations become this strangely full portrait of the varying life of faith and all of the moments in the long life of faith, that there is joy to, not just renunciation and not just longing and seeking. Christus und die Männerseele highlights several aspects of how we should understand our relationship with Christ as a lover. And the first is that the viewer is invited to recognize the mutuality of desire in our relationship with God. We long for Jesus. He longs for us. We say no to things and learn how to turn away from lesser gods. He binds himself for us. He is pierced for us. He delights in the soul's love and beauty. The soul delights in his love and beauty. As in a good human marriage, there is reciprocity, there is true unity and communion. It's not a one-sided relationship of totalitarian control or of one person's pleasure at the cost of the other. The other idea that this image invites us into is the vulnerability in recognizing Jesus as bridegroom. In order to move towards this total congruence in desire and in joy, we must become vulnerable. We must be naked. It works this way in our intimate human relationships, so it's unsurprising in some ways that vulnerability is also a feature of the divine human relationship. And so much of our lives following Christ will be a stripping process away from masks, away from false gods, away from the ways we hide from self-knowledge or the knowledge of other people. And I love how C.S. Lewis talks about the vulnerability of love in the Four Loves. And he writes, "To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable." In other words, when I love someone with my whole heart, whether that is my husband or my children or my friends or my family, my heart walks outside my body and I'm opened up to the possibility of pain and longing in a way that I have never been before. I am never safe or totally my own. I am never unruffled by the vagaries of time and place and history ever again. This is true of friends, parents, siblings, children, lovers, and it is also true of our love for God. Christus und die Seele illustrates that true love is fundamentally cruciform. To love is to become open to pain, to say yes to real life and no to falsehood and selfishness. And this is actually a cross. I hope that the mutuality and the longing and the wounds of Christus und die Seele bring to the forefront one of the great scandals of incarnation. And it's the idea of a vulnerable God that is Jesus in the incarnation. Longing and vulnerability are central to the ancient tradition of Jesus as a lover. And this is one of the reasons why the wounds of Christ, especially the side wound, also became an important image within this tradition. Vulnerable comes from the same Latin word as wound, vulnus. In the Song of Songs 4:9, the English translation of the Vulgate reads, "Thou hast wounded my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast wounded my heart with one of thy eyes and with one hair of thy neck." Commentators and theologians tied this wounding specifically to Christ's side wound, which they conjectured led all the way into his heart. We've already met the wounded Jesus knight in Quia Amore Languio, but it goes further into the tradition of the wounded lover, and this is one of my favorite stanzas concerning Christ's side wound. "In my side I have made her nest. Look in, how wet a wound is here. This is her chamber. Here shall she rest, that she and I may sleep in peace. Here she may wash if she is dirty. Here is shelter for all her woe. Come when she wills, she will have welcome, because I languish for love." Now, if you've never encountered medieval imagery of the side wound before, this might at first seem very weird and borderline horrifying. But the idea of side wound as a refuge, as a source of, paradoxically, cheer and joy, dominated late medieval poetry, imagery, and theology. If this wound was the way into Christ's heart, it offered every hope, every evidence of love, every safety for us wanderers here on earth. For Quia Amore Languio, the wound becomes a nest. It's a bedchamber, a place to wash away sin and stain and dirt, a place to at last fall asleep in safety. Now, how can this be? Let's turn to a medieval theologian to help explain. St. Bernard of Clairvaux was one of the most influential medieval voices in the interpretive Song of Songs tradition. And for him, the wound opening to Christ's heart became a key unlocking the sight of the Lord's will. He preaches so beautifully in his 61st sermon on the Song of Songs, and yes, that is 61 sermons on the Song of Songs. And he wrote more, and he died before he could finish the Song of Songs. So that is the level of obsession we're dealing with here. So he writes, "The nail cries out, the wound cries out that God is truly in Christ, reconciling the world to himself. The iron pierced his soul, and his heart has drawn near, so that he is no longer one who cannot sympathize with my weakness. The secret of his heart is laid open through the clefts of his body. That mighty mystery of loving is laid open. Laid open, too, the tender mercies of our God, in which the morning sun from on high has risen upon us. Surely his heart is laid open in his wounds. His heart is laid open in his wounds. Medieval contemplatives, like the 14th century English writer Richard Rolla, wrote of Christ's wounds as love letters that were written in red ink on skin, which was an especially fitting metaphor for medieval people, given that manuscripts of the era were all made of animal skin, so they already had that touch point there. I love this bizarre picture from Bonne of Luxembourg's prayer book, and it's now at the cloisters in New York City, so not too far. You can go see it. Jesus has unfastened his hand from the cross to direct Bonne and her husband, the Duke of Luxembourg, to meditate upon his side wound as they enter their prayers. That is his direction. Come in, come contemplate. Julian of Norwich, who's my favorite medieval writer, 14th century contemplative Middle English writer, says that just as the mother leads her child tenderly to her breast, so Christ may homely lead us into his blessed breast by his sweet open side, and show us therein part of the Godhead and the joys of heaven with spiritual safety of endless bliss. Spiritual safety. Now, St. Catherine of Siena, another 14th century contemplative writer, living at the same time as Julian, but in Italy. She's writing, advising her spiritual advisor, which is kind of funny. She's advising him, Raymond of Capua, and she writes, "Let your heart and soul be grafted onto the tree of the most holy cross with Christ crucified. Make his wounds your home." So these themes of homemaking, safety, hospitality in the wounds of Jesus, they draw on Psalm 84 and the dwelling place of God. How lovely is your dwelling place, even the sparrow has found herself a home. And the language of nesting, like in Quia Amore Languio, relates to that and also comes from Song of Songs in verse 214. O my dove that art in the clefts of the rock, in the secret places of the stairs, let me see thy countenance. Let me hear thy voice. For sweet is thy voice, and thy countenance is comely. So the ones gazing upon the wounds in this meditative visual tradition become the doves in the cleft of the rock, or the sparrow seeking a home, finding safety in Christ's own body. When I was in college, there's a very popular song that I'm sure some of you have heard that goes, "Home is wherever I'm with you." And this is that kind of love. This is a portrait of that. Homemaking is an intimate part of real love, as intimate as the more erotic and sensual elements. And here we see how the bridegroom offers us himself as home. "Abide in me as I abide in you," Jesus says in the Gospel of John. This is the Jesus who welcomes us home to himself. He has become the nest, the haven. And what's more, it's his wounds, it's his vulnerability that make him home to us, where he washes us clean. Christ welcomes us there. He is holy and hospitable. It's also a promise. With what beauty and love will he treat our own wounds when we are vulnerable with him? What can come out of the deep, dark places where we have been hurt? This lover is gentle and patient, and he's willing to wait for us as long as it takes. So Jesus continues in Quia Amore Languio. "I will abide until she is ready. I will beg her if she says nay. If she is uncaring, I will be direct. If she is disdainful, I will her pray. If she weeps, I will not hide. My arms are here raised to embrace her. Cry once, I come. Now, soul, try it, because I languish for love. One of the telling choices that the poet of Quia Amore Languio makes, that many medieval lyric poems make, is that they eventually become direct addresses to their readers. So we start out with this buffer of the narrator telling his story. He's in the veil of his own restless mind, and he's looking for true love and finds true love searching for man's soul. But midway, the narrator kind of becomes united with us, and Christ directs the reader or the hearer directly. Cry once, I come. Now, soul, try it. The poem becomes invitation to the reader, just like Christus und die Mennende Seele invites its reader into contemplative prayer on being the bride of Christ, just as Mechthild and Henry Suso and others wrote to guide others down devotional paths to recognize the love of God. Now, when we read or encounter materials of the past, we are very often tempted to sequester them off in a different category, to observe them as specimens safely at a historical remove. And obviously, this is often a good thing. We don't want to take on everything from the past wholesale. That would present a huge amount of problems. But it's important to recognize that none of these images and words for their medieval viewers and creators were empty or out in space. They were not like the specimen that you look at historically. They were calls to action, to a way of being in the world. Christ the bridegroom and each of us as his bride represents calling and vocation. So this metaphor is an invitation to spiritual transformation, and it is basically begging us to ask, what do I do now? Now, you may not be ready to go full on St. Catherine of Siena, who famously had a vision of marrying Jesus with not just like a nice normal wedding ring, but a wedding ring made of Christ's foreskin from the circumcision. That's cool, we're not there. Good luck, Catherine, you're awesome. Here's your invitation instead. We're called to imitate the bridegroom in his hospitality, in his fruitfulness, in his love, in his vulnerability and his wounds, by making a home for Jesus in our own hearts. This is an image from the convent of St. Walburg in medieval Germany. It's from the late 15th or early 16th century, and it's one of my favorite images from the late Middle Ages, and it was made for prayer and contemplation. A lot of these convents at this time had resident artists, so one of the nuns would be chosen to create art for her community, and all the rest of the nuns would benefit from this, and they would put them up in their like prayer stalls and use as public, not public, because other people weren't allowed in, but for the nuns to appreciate. And so this is another heart, and it echoes the welcoming heart of Jesus laid bare by the spear. But it is not Jesus' heart, it's the heart of the nun herself. So here she is snuggled up in the arms of the Trinity. You see God the Father, you see Jesus, and you see the Holy Spirit. And they're at a cozy table in fellowship and adoration. And at the hand of God the Father, the scroll says, "O my eternal love, be welcome unto me." And we're not sure who is saying that. It could be the nun, it could be God. Note that she's not wearing her head covering, which is a very deliberate choice and indicates that this is a very personal image of spiritual intimacy with the Godhead. And just like in Christus und die Mennende Seele, when you look at this as part of your contemplative prayer practice, you're supposed to treat this nun as a stand-in for yourself and pray that way. So Jeffrey Hamburger, who was the art historian who first brought these images from St. Walburg into greater notice in his amazing book, Nuns as Artists, he says it really beautifully. In casting the heart as the focal point of union, the drawings define contemplation not as an ecstatic exploration or ascetic ascent, but as an act of restoration and remembrance, a turning inward toward the depths of the soul. And I love that quote, contemplation as an act of restoration. This image depicts what we already quoted from Jesus in John 15:4, abide in me as I abide in you. This is the abide in you part. And also Ephesians 3:17, that Christ may dwell by faith in your hearts, that being rooted and founded in charity, you may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth. It reminds me also of how I learned about transformative faith as a child and the phrase inviting Jesus into your heart. And images like this are fairly rare, Hamburger notes, but it expresses a very common idea in medieval devotion, and that is that the human heart becomes a home for God and that we are invited to stretch and enlarge our hearts for his presence. So this visual meditative practice becomes an invitation to imitation of Christ, to build Christ a home in your own heart, thus becoming more and more like him in the enlarging of your own capacity for love, in restoration of the image of God. So to welcome Christ as bridegroom stretches the heart by grace, by conscious cultivation of love. And Hugh of St. Victor, who was a medieval theologian and contemplative writer and a monastic writer, he writes, enlarge your heart, therefore, so that you may be able to contain him whom the whole world cannot contain. So we're called to imitate Jesus, the lover, in our own loving. Where are we being called into the hospitality of Jesus, the lover? Where into the fruitfulness? Where into the vulnerability and the wounds of loving? Where must our hearts grow and stretch to become big enough for God? Don't mistake any of the charm for sentimentality, though. There is no easy sentimentality in the work of stretching the heart. It becomes a question of where we follow Matthew 16:24, where Jesus tells his disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. This will be a challenge, the final two stanzas of Quia Amore Languio remind us. The stretching and growing of the heart is not effortless, and it will not feel straightforward. Jesus says to the soul, you can long for my love ever so high, but my love is more than thine can be. You weep, you rejoice, I sit by you. Yet would you once, dear, look to me? Should I always feed you with children's food? Nay, love, not so. I will strengthen your love through adversity because I languish for love. Do not grow weary, my own wife. What reward is it to live ever in comfort? In tribulation, I reign more powerfully, oftentimes, than in pleasant seasons. In well and woe, I am here to support. Then, dear soul, go not from me. Your reward is bestowed when you are dead, because I languish for love. In wellness and in woe, here is Christ to support, and the Middle English goes, full and total union only comes when thou art mort, when you are dead. Jesus the lover then ultimately becomes an image looking towards death and judgment. Like Advent coming up, this is an already and not yet kind of situation. Jesus is lover and bridegroom, but the marriage is yet to be consummated in its fullness. The bridegroom and the bride are images from Revelation, from the end of history. And in Revelation 22:17, athirst with love, the bride cries, come to her bridegroom, and he comes. Perhaps in death, and more obviously, likely in judgment, he at last arrives to consummate his marriage with the soul. And we all know that weddings are barely the tip of the iceberg of the marriage, of the full marriage. If the fruitfulness is already there, the tenderness, the generosity, the homemaking, the hospitality, what then is yet to come? How will all this deepen and grow as human marriages do? And this is always when the mystics start to get super mystical. This last little image in Christus und der meinende Seele is one of total union, the embrace of the marriage. And Mechthild of Magdeburg records the potential conversation between the soul and the bridegroom in this moment. And Jesus says to her, "Stay, lady soul." And Mechthild answers, "What do you bid me, Lord?" "Take off your clothes." "Lord, what will happen to me then?" "Lady soul, you are so utterly formed to my nature that not the slightest thing can be between you and me. Never was angel so glorious that to him was granted for 1 hour what is given to you for eternity." And I love how the 20th century Anglican nun and skilled medieval translator, Sister Penelope Lawson, writes of this. And she was deeply influenced by all these medieval texts she had translated. And she says, "For even the New Jerusalem is only the bride of the Lamb. And when she goes in with him to the marriage feast, the door is shut, and we have no inkling of what, in the eternal creativeness of love, will issue from their union." The eternal creativity of love. Now, of course, all of this is an allegory. All of this is a metaphor. It can barely begin to capture something about the nature of our union with God. But what all these medieval writers tell us is that learning to long for this union with the triune God is a vocation for our lives right now. What we desire shapes how we see the world. And this longing will change how we see other people, change how we understand ourselves, and most of all, change how we understand Jesus and his love. Thanks.